There is a fear living inside you that you did not earn. You did not fall. You did not burn. You did not watch something terrible happen and carry the image home with you like a wound that never fully closed. You simply arrived in this world already afraid of certain things, already wired to recoil from specific shapes, specific sounds, specific arrangements of the world that your conscious mind has never had reason to fear. And the most disturbing part is not that the fear exists. The most disturbing part is that it was placed there by people who died thousands of years before you were born. This is the psychology of innate fear, the science of terror that requires no experience to take root, the study of phobias that were not learned but inherited, not passed down through stories or warnings or childhood trauma, but encoded directly into the architecture of your nervous system at a level so deep that no amount of rational understanding has ever been able to fully reach it. You can know, with complete intellectual certainty, that the spider in the corner of the room cannot hurt you. You can recite the statistics. You can remind yourself that it is smaller than your thumbnail, that it has no interest in you, that the probability of harm is essentially zero, and your body will not care. Your body received a different memo, a much older one, written not in language but in the ancient biological shorthand of survival, passed from nervous system to nervous system across hundreds of generations, arriving in you intact and fully operational, before you had even drawn your first breath. That is where we begin. Not with the fear you developed, with the fear you inherited, with the question that most people never think to ask. What if some of what terrifies you most was never really yours to begin with? The architecture of fear. Before we can understand why certain fears require no experience to exist, we need to understand what fear actually is at the level of the body and the brain. Fear is not an emotion in the way that sadness or joy are emotions. It is a system, a biological alarm network of extraordinary complexity and extraordinary age that evolved not to make you feel something, but to make you survive something. Its job is not psychological. Its job is physiological. It exists to move blood to your muscles, to dilate your pupils, to release cortisol and adrenaline into your bloodstream, to shut down the parts of your brain that deliberate and activate the parts that react. The fear system does not think. It responds. And it was designed to respond faster than thought because in the environments where it evolved, the time between perceiving a threat and responding to it was often the difference between living and not living. At the center of this system sits a small almond-shaped structure deep in the temporal lobe called the amygdala. Two of them, actually, one in each hemisphere of the brain. The amygdala is one of the oldest structures in the mammalian brain. It predates language, predates conscious reasoning, predates almost everything we think of as characteristically human, and its function is as simple and as brutal as evolution tends to be. It detects threat. It triggers response. What makes the amygdala remarkable in the context of innate fear is what it is already looking for when you are born. Before experience has taught it anything, before the world has had the chance to show it a single dangerous thing, the amygdala arrives preloaded, pre-tuned to certain frequencies of danger that your ancestors encountered so consistently, and that cost them so dearly when they missed them, that the detection apparatus itself became heritable, became part of what is passed on. And the things it was pre-tuned to are not random. They follow a logic. The cold, ruthless logic of what killed the most people, across the most generations, across the longest stretch of human evolutionary history. The ancestral ledger. There is a way of reading human fear that most people never encounter. A way of looking at the specific content of our most common phobias and asking not what happened to this particular person, but what happened to our species. What dangers, repeated across enough generations and at high enough cost, would have eventually produced a survival advantage in the individuals who feared them automatically, rather than having to learn to fear them the hard way. The answer, when you look at it this way, reads like a ledger of ancestral catastrophe. Snakes appear in the fear responses of human infants before those infants have had any meaningful exposure to snakes. Research conducted across multiple cultural contexts, including populations where snakes are essentially absent from daily life, has confirmed that human beings show accelerated threat detection for snake-shaped stimuli. that we orient toward and process visual information, consistent with the shape of a snake faster than we process other threatening stimuli, that this acceleration is present in children too young to have formed it through experience. The evolutionary logic is not difficult to follow. Snakes were a significant cause of mortality across the environments in which our ancestors lived for millions of years. The hominids who survived snake encounters at higher rates were not necessarily the ones who were stronger or faster. They were the ones whose nervous systems detected the snake fastest, the ones who recoiled before conscious recognition had occurred, the ones for whom the gap between perception and response was smallest. Those individuals survived at higher rates. They reproduced at higher rates. And over hundreds of thousands of generations, the hair-trigger snake detection apparatus became a feature of the human nervous system rather than an individual trait. The fear did not need to be learned because the cost of learning it was too high. By the time an individual had enough experience with snakes to develop a rational assessment of the danger, many of those individuals were already dead. Evolution does not wait for experience, it builds the lesson into the system. Spiders follow a similar logic, and yet the spider case is even more interesting because the evidence suggests that the human fear response to spiders is calibrated not just to spiders in general, but to specific features of spiders: the irregular, unpredictable movement pattern, the combination of a central body mass and multiple extending limbs, the speed of directional change. These specific features trigger the fear response more reliably than spider images that lack them. This suggests a degree of specificity in the inherited fear apparatus that goes well beyond a general wariness of creeping things. It suggests something that was tuned by experience across generations to recognize not just a category of danger, but the specific perceptual signature of that category. Heights produce a version of innate fear that is perhaps the most elegantly studied. The visual cliff experiment, conducted first with human infants and later replicated across dozens of species, demonstrated that young animals, including human infants who have not yet walked, show behavioral avoidance of perceived drops before they have had any experience of falling. The fear is not of falling. It cannot be. They have never fallen. The fear is of the visual perception of height differential, of the specific optical information that the brain has been pre-wired to interpret as dangerous before any experience has confirmed that it is. This is the ancestral ledger. Heights killed. Falling from trees, from cliffs, from any elevated surface in the environments where hominids evolved, produced injuries that were often fatal in the absence of modern medicine. The individuals whose nervous systems produced automatic avoidance responses to height perception left more descendants than the individuals whose nervous systems waited for the experience of falling to teach them caution. And then there is the darkness. What lives in the dark? The human fear of darkness is so universal, so cross-cultural, so present across the developmental spectrum from infancy onward, that it has become almost invisible through familiarity. We treat it as a given, as something too basic to require explanation. Children are afraid of the dark. Of course they are, everyone knows that. But stop for a moment and consider what that actually means. Darkness contains nothing. In the absolute sense, the absence of light is the absence of information. There is nothing in darkness itself that can hurt you. And yet the human nervous system responds to darkness with a specific and measurable activation of the threat detection system that does not require any experience of being harmed in darkness to produce. The logic, again, is ancestral. The hominid environments in which human fear evolved were populated with predators. Many of those predators were nocturnal, or at least capable of operating in low-light conditions more effectively than the primarily diurnal, visually dependent humans they hunted. Darkness was not merely the absence of light. It was the withdrawal of the primary sensory advantage that our ancestors possessed. It was the leveling of the playing field in favor of things that wanted to eat them. The individuals who responded to darkness with heightened alertness, with the automatic activation of threat detection systems, with the behavioral tendency to seek shelter and avoid open exposure, survived at higher rates than those who moved through darkness with the same casual confidence they applied to daylight. And that heightened response to darkness became, over deep time, a feature rather than a quirk. What makes this particularly interesting is the specific phenomenology of fear in darkness. It is not simply that things become harder to see, it is that the imagination, freed from the anchoring influence of visual information, begins to populate the darkness with threats. The brain, receiving no information about what is out there, defaults to the assumption that something is. This is not irrationality. It is a deeply rational Bayesian response to uncertainty in an environment where the cost of a false negative, of assuming safety when danger is present, was historically catastrophic. Better to fear the empty darkness 1,000 times than to fail to fear it. The one time something is genuinely there. This is why the fear of darkness in humans is not merely the discomfort of limited vision. It is the activation of an ancient anticipatory threat system that was built for a world where darkness was a genuine invitation to death. The fact that you live in a house with locks and electric lights and a nearly complete absence of nocturnal predators has not updated the system. The system does not read the current environment. It reads the ancestral one, the face in the crowd. There is a category of innate human fear that is less discussed than snakes and heights and darkness. But that is in some ways more psychologically complex, more revealing of something deep and strange about the human condition. It is the fear of being watched, not the social anxiety of being evaluated or judged, something older and more primitive than that. The specific, involuntary, skin-prickling sensation that something is looking at you, even when no visible threat is present. The sudden conviction, rising from somewhere below conscious thought, that you are being observed. Research on this phenomenon has produced some genuinely unsettling findings. Human beings have a detection system for being observed that operates below the level of conscious awareness, and that is sensitive enough to detect the direction of another person's gaze with remarkable accuracy, even in peripheral vision. We know when someone is looking at us before we have consciously processed that information. The knowledge arrives faster than the recognition. The evolutionary logic connects directly to predation. An animal that is unaware it is being watched by a predator is in a fundamentally more dangerous position than one that detects the observation and can respond to it. The hominids who could feel the weight of observation, who had a nervous system sensitive enough to detect the attentional focus of a potential threat before that threat had made its move, had a survival advantage over those who did not. And that sensitivity, refined across generations of actual predation pressure, became part of the human sensory apparatus. But the fear goes further than the practical matter of predator detection. There is something about the experience of being watched that activates a specific kind of existential unease in human beings that seems disproportionate to any practical danger that observation alone could pose. The feeling of eyes upon you in an empty room, the sensation of being followed that persists even after you have looked back and seen nothing, the specific horror of the horror genre image of a face at the window, looking in. These responses tap into something that the evolutionary account alone does not fully explain. They connect to a layer of human psychology in which being seen carries a meaning that extends beyond the practical, in which observation is associated not just with predation but with exposure, with vulnerability, with the radical contingency of being a creature that can be found, the uncanny valley. In 1970, Japanese robotics professor Masahiro Mori described a phenomenon he called the uncanny valley. The observation that as robots and artificial representations of humans become more realistic, they become more appealing to human observers, but that at a certain point of near but not quite human resemblance, the response flips sharply into revulsion and unease. The phenomenon has been replicated, debated, and studied extensively in the decades since. And what has emerged from that research is something more interesting than a curiosity about robot design. It is a window into one of the most ancient and most automated of human fear systems. The system designed to detect the wrong kind of human. Consider what a near human that is not quite human would have represented in the ancestral environment. A person exhibiting unusual behavioral or physical features. Moving wrong. Responding wrong. Presenting the superficial appearance of a group member while failing to pass some deeper test of actual membership. In the environments where human social cognition evolved, such individuals represented specific categories of threat. Severe illness, which could be contagious. Neurological compromise, which could be behaviorally unpredictable. Deception, the presentation of group membership signals by an individual whose actual allegiances lay elsewhere. The revulsion that modern human beings feel when confronted with near-human representations that fail the deep test of actual humanness is not a reaction to robots. It is the activation of an ancient pathogen and deception detection system that was built to keep your ancestors from getting too close to something that looked almost right, but was not right enough. This fear, like the others we have examined, requires no experience to operate. You do not need to have been harmed by a near-human entity. You do not need to have been deceived by someone wearing a human mask. The system runs automatically because the cost of its failure, in the ancestral environment, was so high that it became part of the basic operating system rather than an optional feature that individuals had to develop through experience. The transmission. By now, the question that deserves the most careful attention is this: how exactly does fear get transmitted across generations without experience? What is the actual biological mechanism by which a fear that was genuinely earned by your great-great-great ancestors arrives in your nervous system fully formed? The answer has multiple layers. The oldest and best understood layer is genetic. The evolution of specific neural architectures, specific sensory detection mechanisms, specific amygdala calibrations that predispose the developing nervous system to respond to certain categories of stimuli with fear responses. This is not the inheritance of a specific memory or a specific experience. It is the inheritance of a specific kind of wiring that makes certain fears easier to acquire, and in some cases makes them essentially automatic. But there is a second layer that is more recent and more scientifically provocative. The field of epigenetics has produced evidence, contested but accumulating, that traumatic experiences can alter gene expression in ways that are heritable, that the biochemical signature of a significant fear experience can modify how genes are expressed in subsequent generations without altering the genetic sequence itself. Research on this phenomenon in animal models has shown that specific learned fear responses, particularly those associated with significant threat, can be transmitted to offspring who were never exposed to the original threatening stimulus. The offspring show behavioral fear responses and corresponding neural activation patterns consistent with the parental fear, despite having had no direct experience of the thing their parent learned to fear. The implications of this, if they extend robustly to humans, are genuinely staggering. They suggest that the trauma your ancestors experienced, the specific encounters with specific dangers in specific environments, may have left biochemical traces that are still present in how your genes express themselves today. That the fear in your body is not merely a product of the general evolutionary pressure that shaped the human species over millions of years. It may also carry the specific signature of particular experiences in your particular ancestral line. You may be afraid of something that your great-grandmother was afraid of, not because you inherited a general predisposition to that kind of fear, but because her specific fear experience left a mark in the biochemistry of her reproductive cells that was passed to her children and their children and eventually to you. That is a different kind of inheritance than we are accustomed to thinking about. Not just the general shape of the nervous system, but the specific emotional residue of specific lives lived in specific conditions of danger and loss. The fear that cannot be reasoned with. Here is where the psychology becomes both most practical and most uncomfortable. If certain fears are genuinely innate, if they exist in the nervous system prior to and independent of any personal experience that would justify them, then the standard therapeutic approach to fear, the approach built on the logic that fears are learned and can therefore be unlearned, runs directly into a wall. Exposure therapy works by the mechanism of extinction learning. You are repeatedly exposed to the feared stimulus in a safe context until the conditioned association between the stimulus and the fear response weakens and eventually disappears. It works because it targets the mechanism by which fears are normally formed, the pairing of a neutral stimulus with an aversive experience, until the neutral stimulus alone produces the fear response. But innate fears were never formed this way. They were not created by a pairing of stimulus and aversive experience in the individual's own life. They arrived preformed, and attempting to extinguish them through the logic of extinction learning is like trying to update software through a process designed for a different operating system. This is why treatment outcomes for certain specific phobias, particularly the evolutionarily prepared ones, show a pattern that is different from outcomes for other anxiety conditions. The fears can be managed. The behavioral response to them can be modified. The individual can learn to function normally in the presence of the feared stimulus. But the underlying fear response, the automatic amygdala activation, the involuntary physiological reaction, tends to be more resistant to complete elimination than fears that were genuinely learned through experience. The body remembers what your ancestors survived, and it is reluctant to forget it, regardless of what your rational mind has concluded about the actual level of danger in your current environment. This creates a particular kind of psychological experience that many people find deeply distressing. The experience of knowing that a fear is irrational, understanding completely and intellectually that the feared thing poses no genuine danger, and yet being unable to prevent the fear response from occurring. The knowledge and the fear coexist without resolving each other, because they live in different parts of the brain. The knowledge lives in the prefrontal cortex, in the regions that handle conscious reasoning and rational assessment. The fear lives in the amygdala, in a structure that does not take instructions from the prefrontal cortex when it has already decided that something in the environment matches its threat profile. The fears you cannot name. Beyond the specific phobias that evolutionary psychology has most thoroughly documented, there is a category of innate human fear that is harder to locate and harder to explain. It is the fear of things that have no name, the feeling that arises in certain kinds of empty spaces. Not the practical discomfort of being alone in a dangerous location. Something else. Something that old literature and old mythology and old religious traditions tried to capture with words like dread and awe and the numinous. The feeling of standing at the edge of something that your ordinary categories of understanding cannot contain. The psychologist Rudolf Otto called this the experience of the mysterium tremendum, the frightening mystery, the encounter with something that is simultaneously fascinating and terrifying, precisely because it exceeds the frameworks the mind normally uses to make the world manageable and safe. He was writing about religious experience, about the encounter with what he called the holy other. But the psychological structure he described maps onto something that is present even in entirely secular contexts. There are places where this feeling arises reliably. The edge of the ocean at night, the interior of certain ancient structures, the moment of complete silence in a forest when every animal sound stops simultaneously. Caves. The specific quality of light just before a storm of unusual intensity. These are not random triggers. They are specific environmental configurations that share a common feature. They confront the human nervous system with the limits of its own predictive capacity, with the sudden awareness that the immediate environment contains more than its ordinary models can account for. And the response to that confrontation is an ancient one. It is fear of a particular quality that is also, always, strangely, a kind of wonder. This fear, which has no name in the clinical literature but which most human beings recognize immediately when it is described, may be the deepest form of innate fear. Not the fear of a specific thing, not the fear of snakes or heights or darkness or the watching face, but the fear of the uncontainable itself, of the edges of the knowable world, of whatever lies beyond the reach of the predictive systems that the mind uses to keep reality manageable. It is the fear that has driven human beings to build religions and cosmologies and elaborate systems of meaning since the beginning of recorded history. Not because those systems have eliminated the fear, but because they have given it a shape. Because a fear that can be named, that can be placed in a story and given a role in a larger narrative, is a fear that can be lived with. Whereas the fear that has no name, that has no story, that confronts you with the raw fact of the unknowable, is a fear that no amount of rational understanding has ever been able to completely quiet. Living with what you inherited. There is a question that sits beneath everything we have examined in this exploration, and it is not the scientific question of how innate fear is transmitted or the therapeutic question of how it can be managed. It is the philosophical question of what it means to carry something you did not choose. You are not merely an individual. You are the current terminus of an unbroken chain of survivors stretching back to the beginning of your species. Every person in that chain was afraid of something. Every person in that chain encountered dangers that their bodies responded to before their minds had caught up. And every person in that chain survived those encounters, or you would not exist. Their fear, their specific calibrated automatic response to the specific dangers of their specific environments, is part of why you are here. The fear you were born with is not a flaw. It is a gift from people whose names you will never know, whose faces you will never see, whose lives you cannot imagine. They did not choose to give it to you. Evolution does not work through intention, but the effect is the same. You carry their survival in your nervous system. You carry the biological memory of what threatened them. You carry the automatic wisdom of what kept them alive. And yes, that wisdom is calibrated for a world that no longer exists in the same form. The snakes are mostly gone. The predators that hunted your ancestors in the darkness are not waiting outside your door. The heights your nervous system evolved to fear were different heights in different landscapes. The system is running an older program on newer hardware in a changed environment. But the program is not wrong. It is simply from a different time. Understanding that is not a cure for innate fear. Nothing in this exploration has pretended to offer a cure for what is essentially a feature of being human rather than a bug. But understanding it changes the relationship. It transforms the experience of irrational fear from an embarrassing personal weakness into something more honest, into the recognition that you are a body built by history, inhabited by the echoes of your ancestors' terror and survival, running systems designed for conditions you have never personally encountered. The fear you were born with is not yours. Not entirely. It was earned by people long before you. And what they earned, through encounters with darkness and serpents and predators and the cold, indifferent face of a world that was trying to kill them, they passed to you. Not as a burden, as a protection. One you carry whether you chose it or not. One that has been running quietly in the background of every moment of your life, scanning for dangers your conscious mind has never had to face, keeping you safe from threats that have not visited you yet. That is the oldest form of love there is. The kind that does not know it is love. The kind that simply endures and passes itself on, and endures again.